It's on. Can you hear me? Great. Thanks everybody for coming in the rain. My name is Michael Clemens. I'm here at the Center for Global Development, and I work on migration. I'm just delighted that the Urban Institute and the World Bank have really stepped up and scaled up their work in this important area at the time of a crisis. You're going to hear about their work and our related work today. You know, in the crisis, I have been often inspired by what happened in the Hungarian Revolution, 1956. 200,000 people suddenly leaving Hungary, almost all of them ending up suddenly in Austria. 3% of the population of Austria at a time when Austria was much poorer than today, still recovering from World War II, just a dramatically greater crisis in relative terms than any European country is experiencing at this moment. And you know, those people could have been a huge burden. They could have been rounded up and kept in a camp, suspected of being communist spies and terrorists, etc. What happened instead was dramatically different. A coalition of 37 countries came together and immediately, permanently resettled them all over the world. And when I say immediately, I mean within 10 weeks of the start of the crisis, more than half of them had been permanently resettled. More than 100,000 people in 10 weeks permanently resettled, and of course they were nothing but a burden. They were nothing there were no kind of burden where they went. They were a benefit to the places that they went. One of them, Stephen Udvar-Hazy, donated a museum to the Washington area that many of you have probably been to out by Dulles. It's really an inspiration for what is possible in a historic but manageable crisis like the one that we face right now. Here at CGD, we're going to be continuing work in this area, exploring links between forced migration and other kinds of migration. I want to take the opportunity to invite you back here April 19th. Cindy Huang and her colleagues are going to be launching the final report of a study group on forced migration and development. Big draws will be David Miliband, the head of IRC, will be here, the CEO of the World Bank, Kristalina Georgieva, as well as the ministers of planning of Jordan and the minister of displaced persons for Lebanon. Here in this room, April 19th, please come back. Right now, I want to welcome Chaz Cadwell of the Urban Institute, who will be running the show. And he's the director of the Center on International Development and Governance at Urban Institute. And I leave you in his capable hands. Thank you, Chaz.
Thank you very much, Michael. It's my pleasure to join Michael in welcoming you here, and I want to thank the Center for Global Development for hosting today's event. My name is Charles Cadwell. I lead one of 10 research centers at the Urban Institute focusing on international development and governance, where we have been stretching our focus on service delivery, urban governance, to include the issues of urban refugees in a variety of circumstances. So today's discussion on refugees in urban settings, improving self-reliance, reducing aid dependence, is a chance for all of us to talk about our work with important colleagues. We're fortunate to have a panel of really significant expertise on the challenges facing refugees. You have the biographies, I believe, of Paulo Verma, the program manager at the World Bank's Fragility, Conflict, and Violence Initiative. My colleague Amar Malik is Senior Research Associate at the Urban Institute. Lauren Landau, who's the head of the African Center for Migration and Society at Wits University in South Africa, and CGD's own Cindy Wang. I urge your attention to the details of their rich experience, but I'm not going to take time right now to go through it all. Each of the speakers, as it happens, has either a recently released or a forthcoming piece of work on today's topic. So we're giving you current and live information today. The format for the discussion today is pretty straightforward. I'm going to ask some questions of each of our panelists and hope in doing so to cover a lot of ground very quickly and then preserve ample time at the end for your questions. There's a lot of expertise in the room here. We want to hear from you as well. So we're going to preserve 35 minutes at the end for your questions. Before we get going, I'll remind people, if you can, to please silence your cell phone. That still needs being said, I guess. But I also want to welcome an online audience today. This is being webcast and I guess on YouTube as well. Those of you who are online, if you have questions, you need to point those to hashtag CGD Talks. Do I have that right? Yes, thank you. But also, if you will, add direct these to @Urban Institute, all one word, and @CGD. If you're watching on the YouTube channel, there's a comment line where you can ask questions as well, and we'll feed those into the conversation. Michael Clemens has described a crisis. It's a big challenge we're facing. So I want to start our discussion by asking our panelists to help set the scene more specifically. In doing so, I want to note there are a few things that we're probably not going to talk about today. We're not talking about the conflicts and other sources that create refugees. We're not going to resolve the question here today of how many refugees a country should or should not accept. And we're probably not going to focus on refugees who are in camps. What we are going to talk about is people who, for one reason or other, find themselves in a city that's not their own. And as we will hear, the numbers and the needs of the millions of people in this circumstance is overwhelming resources available and local systems. Something I read just yesterday, the UN is suggesting that in Syria alone, they're going to need $8 billion this year to deal with displaced people. That's a staggering burden. So I wanted to start by asking Paulo if you could set out some facts about urban refugees and the challenge this poses for the international community. In earlier conversations we had, you suggested that there was a paradigm shift coming about between the thinking about humanitarian work and development work. And so if you could take a couple of minutes, explain why this is important in an urban setting, what's led to the new thinking, and what is the shift actually comprised of?
Thank you, Charles, and thank you for the invitation to the Center for Global Development and the Urban Institute. I'm very pleased to be here. And I'd like to make an historical reference, as Michael did, because I think it's useful to put the current crisis into context. If we think about displacement crisis and displacement policies in terms of their evolution over time, we can think about three defining changes. The first phase is the phase where the refugees and displaced people were really the business of specialized agencies, the UNHCR in particular. So they were humanitarian in nature, and they were to be addressed by humanitarian organizations. Now, that phase sort of transited into a second phase. You can think of that as displacement policies 2.0, where we realized that actually humanitarian crises were very long-term, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. And as we did that, we started to realize that the development organizations needed to come in to have a role in addressing the plight of refugees and IDPs. Now, when that happened, the first thought was, well, let's see whether a crisis lasts long. If it does, then we call the development organizations to come in and work with us. Well, it turns out that the crises were very long, and that this question of passing from a humanitarian kind of approach to a development kind of approach was very complex. What the French call the relève, trying to pick up from what the humanitarian organizations did and work with the development organizations and solve the long-term problems. That also didn't work. So we're now shifting to the displacement policy 3.0, which is, well, humanitarian and development organizations need to work together from day one. Now, the problem with that is that we don't really have a blueprint for that. What does it mean? What does it mean to have the World Bank or UNDP working with the UNHCR from day one when refugees are crossing the border? What do we do? How do we organize ourselves? So we don't have a blueprint. But I think we have two defining, again, historical events that help us to first understand that we needed to move towards this displacement policy 3.0, and second, gave us some ideas on what to do. And these were first the Syrian crisis, and therefore this massive increase in the numbers of people displaced, half of the population of Syria. And secondly, the fact that this crisis occurred very close to Europe, and eventually generated the migration crisis in Europe. And that brought the crisis much closer to people in the West and to donors. So the reaction was the donors said, well, this is at our door. We cannot ignore this anymore. We need the development organizations to come in. We need the World Bank to step in. And so we have a large increase in funding channeled towards development organizations, asking them, you need to do something together with the humanitarian organizations. This is what changed historically, I think, the current picture. Now, we don't have a blueprint. So what do? Well, we came up with some initial ideas that I'm sure will be discussed more in detail in a second. But essentially, one paradigm shift, which I think is very important to keep in mind, is that we're moving to the idea that refugees' problems are referred to a particular type of populations, refugees or IDPs, to an idea where actually this is an area-based problem. There is an area affected by a major crisis, sparked by refugees and IDPs, but actually affecting host populations as well. And how do we deal with this area crisis? And this is where I think the urban dimension becomes very important, because we're shifting from population to area-based interventions. So we understood that. Now, the know-how of how to do this is still very much, I think, up in the air, and we're working to try to figure out how that happens.
And so I guess the bank, along with UNHCR and others, have developed this idea of a coordination mechanism, a compact of some sort. And there have been how many of those established at this point?
2.5, I would say.
2.5, okay. Cindy, I know you've been doing work to think about how these things might actually move from 2.5 to 10.5 or some other number. How hopeful should we be that some new way of working together is actually going to either keep up with or get ahead of this huge problem?
Great. Thank you so much. I just wanted to start by acknowledging the International Rescue Committee. We have some of their staff here today because the study group that Michael mentioned is a joint CGD IRC study group, and that is, in fact, one of our small step forward in that joint work that needs to happen. And so we thought it was, and it has been, a very productive partnership. One other small caveat, I have really bad allergies now, so I apologize for my voice. I won't infect you with anything. It's just allergies, and apologies if I have some cough drops here, but hopefully my voice will be okay. So the inspiration for the study group was, in fact, this step change in engagement by the World Bank. Again, not as a handoff in a relay race, but really in being engaged from the beginning in the analysis and planning and implementation that needs to happen jointly. And I think what Paulo mentioned about it being place-based is so important, because we know now 75% of refugees are living in urban non-camp settings. And so this is, it's a really important approach. And so what we've been looking at in particular are the compacts, the two that are already in implementation in Jordan and Lebanon, and recognizing that it is a huge step forward, that the compact structure itself offers a promising solution for a number of reasons. First, it creates a structure for the partnership itself, so to know who's at the table and to make sure there are humanitarian and development actors there at the beginning. It also helps align incentives, because when you start planning, there are short, medium, and long-term needs, and there are different resources and investments and expertise that are needed along the way. So the compact also offers a way to bring that in through a negotiation. And third, because in this discussion, we've seen an emphasis on the need for multi-year funding. It's a huge gap that while crises last for 5, 10, 20 years, and in fact in 2013, humanitarian funding, which is 1 year, 2/3 of it went to crises that lasted 7, 8 years or more. So there's a real mismatch in the tools, but the compact structure allows you to bring together these actors in a multi-year agreement. And our report, I won't reveal too much because I want you to all come back on April 19th. It offers ideas for this, the tools and approaches that should be part of this blueprint. So for example, while the existing compacts have brought together different actors, we recommend that there are types of guidance and procedures that should be put in place, because we've seen that at a high level you have the World Bank and UNHCR, but of course, some of you know I'm an anthropologist by training, so I always like to emphasize, well, we need the refugees, we need the communities, we need the local governments in there in the discussions from the beginning. And so there's guidance by the IFC and many other organizations on how to do this, and we feel in the refugee context, it's also important to have some of those standards. And I'll just provide one more example in that when you're bringing together this portfolio, we are proposing that you need some criteria for addressing the medium and long-term needs. There will always be the short-term urgent responses that are required. But in the example of the Jordan Compact, there's been quite an emphasis on the piece around work permits, and particularly work in special economic zones. But the World Bank has done some of the best research on how special economic zones, they do take quite a while to develop. They're not a perfect solution, but they're part of a broader mix. And so we think while that should be part of the portfolio, potentially greater emphasis should be placed on the medium-term interventions that are tailored for both refugees and their host communities. And an example of that would be to increase the speed of the business formalization processes, and that is part of the compact, but that hasn't been pushed as much in the implementation phase. So how can we speed that up and really offer nearer term opportunities to refugees and their host communities? And then finally, we propose around data. There's quite a bit of an evidence and data gap, and I think our colleagues from the Urban Institute are trying to fill some of that. But we believe we need a kind of a data and evidence alliance to make sure that the data is out there, is real, and evidence is used, but also to generate new data and evidence, and also increase the use of tools like pay for performance. And I would just close by saying, it's kind of like, the World Bank, there's this huge new funding opportunity in the IDA 18 replenishment. There's a $2 billion window for refugee hosting countries, but I would not put all of the pressure on our colleagues in the World Bank, in the sense that there are other opportunities like the EU Trust Fund for Africa, which is addressing migration issues, including forced displacement, the Education Can't Wait platform. So we feel that compacts and these tools and approaches should be applied more broadly to the resources that are available.
Thank you, Cindy. I've got lots of questions, but I'll reserve those for a moment. And let me ask Lauren, who may have a less cheery view of the possibility of donor coordination, to talk about your experience working on the ground.
Right. Well, thank you. I mean, I think what I have to say builds very closely on the others, and I do. There's this sort of adage that a crisis is also an opportunity, and clearly the Syrian crisis has brought together a set of actors who otherwise might not be speaking together. Of course, we have to remember that urban refugees are not just a Middle East phenomenon, and that the models and the responses to the Syrian crisis or to the Iraq crisis is not necessarily the model that should be followed globally. And I think you mentioned that we don't have a blueprint yet. And I would just caution against actually a single blueprint for trying to engage locally around. We come from a position that protection of refugees, and as with urban development, is fundamentally a political process, and that, as the old adage says, all politics is local. And if we want to really engage in spaces where refugees meet host populations, we need to build on a number of principles. And probably the first of this is a kind of local literacy. And so UNHCR and others have put a huge amount of money into developing profiling mechanisms for urban refugees. What they don't do is ask about the host populations. And even then, they don't ask about local institutions. They don't look at what are the incentives that would encourage a municipal authority to engage or to scapegoat a refugee. They're not looking at municipal finance systems that would allow them to respond effectively to a changing or very rapidly changing transformation. They're not looking at the nature of the housing market, at the very micro level regulation of trading markets. And this is really what we need to do. And so humanitarians coming in, I think, need to begin with that local literacy and then build programs that allow them to evolve. But as they do that, a number of principles, I think, can really help inform that. And one is a kind of constant search for solidarity, and what has happened with this sort of at multiple levels. So this is solidarity between development actors and humanitarians, but also looking for opportunities to build solidarities between refugees and local populations. So humanitarians tend to say, look, this is the group that we care about. Our funding is conditional on only providing assistance for refugees. And what this does is separate them and isolate them from local populations, often building what we've seen, considerable resentment against them from host populations and from local government, who see them as this privileged population who is protected while their own populations suffer. So instead of saying, look, and I think this builds on what both of you have said, instead of moving from working on a person-based assistance program, is really to move from person to place and say, look, what does this area need? How do we incentivize the local population to benefit from this, whether that's improved housing or healthcare or other kind of urban development that is made conditional on refugees being there and being welcomed. And this fits broadly what my colleague Caroline and I have been calling stealth humanitarianism, which is to come into these spaces not with the flags and the tents and the other sorts of UNHCR or other branding, but to try to go in through back routes and to try to say, look, what can we do behind the scenes to help a local politician so that she or he will in turn help refugees? So that also, not only is that more effective, it stops the resentment against refugees, but it builds an incentive for local politicians to absorb, to take these people, rather than seeing them as a burden. So I think that sort of pragmatic pathways is what's required, but there's not a single blueprint that will do that. It requires a lot of local knowledge. It requires urban humanitarians to think a little bit differently about how they engage in these spaces, to start quickly where there's an emergency, but to immediately reflect. And clearly, data gathering, coordination, and reflection is important, but it's not just refugee data that we need. It's a real fundamental integrated urban analysis. So I'll just end there. Thanks.
Thank you, Lauren. Amar, working with Lauren and others, you've just finished a detailed look at refugees in 3 countries, in particular their ability to develop livelihoods. I guess these are, at this point, all longer extending refugee circumstances. And I should note that this work included Amar and Lauren, but also some other colleagues here, Carolyn Quijano, Yasmin Irvin Erickson, and Eddie Moore, who I think are with us today. But you looked at particularly the salience of social networks among refugees. How I can imagine in my own head there's pluses and minuses to those social networks, and or picking up on Lauren's point, the fact that every place is different. Can you just help us get started into looking at the refugees as opposed to the donors?
Right. So, as was said earlier, the majority of refugees and IDPs now are in urban areas. So our motivation was to try to understand the economic opportunities and challenges that come with refugees living in urban neighborhoods. So economic opportunities are obvious. There's access to jobs and maybe more support structure, but physical proximity with host communities can exacerbate some of the challenges that Lauren was talking about. And then also, we were focused on trying to understand the varied role that social networks play in promoting self-reliance of refugees. So if a family makes their way into a new city, especially at the beginning when there's an absence of institutional support structures, they look to their social networks, which could be within the host community, but mostly within the refugee community. And this is a very complex, complicated thing because there's complicating factors that we were interested in. One, the relations between the refugee community and the host community, the view of the host state about the conflict where refugees are coming from, the local political economy that Lauren was talking about, and then also there's obvious competition for economic resources and access to basic services where refugee and host communities become more competitive in that environment. And then obviously we've talked about how this scale of this whole crisis and the protracted nature of this means that there's the model of direct assistance is obviously unsustainable. So we were focused a lot to not just talk about the conceptual frames from sociology and other literature where there's a lot of knowledge on this topic, but actually to make recommendations, which I can talk about a bit later. So with that in mind, we wanted to also make a contribution by doing a fieldwork and surveys on the ground. We picked 3 cities and did interviews with 1,000 refugees in each. First city was Peshawar in Pakistan, where refugees have lived for a very long time, but they are very homogeneous population, and they are ethnically, religiously, and linguistically more or less the same as ethnic Pashtuns living in Pakistan. The second was Gaziantep, where the refugee population is mostly Syrian Arab, but the host population has different ethnicity, and this is a more recent conflict. The third is a tremendously diverse place, Nairobi, where there's almost half of the refugees we talked to were Somalis, but there's also over a dozen different community groups in terms of countries that they're coming from. So the dynamics there are a little different. So we wanted to compare these 3 cases. And so the broadly speaking, the coverage of our things was, we started with the basic demographic and economic indicators, but we then went on to do what is called egocentric analysis, where you take an individual, focus on them as the unit of analysis, and then try to build their social network. So what we would do typically is ask a refugee to think about the 4 or 5 people that they would go to if they need assistance in finding housing or looking for work, and then ask them a bunch of questions about those people so as to build a sort of some sense of what their network looks like. And then at the end, we also ask some questions about their perceptions of the future, how positive they feel about their outlook and access to technology and other things. So there are copies of this report outside, and you're welcome to pick up to read the details, but I'll just highlight 2 things. One is that despite all the attention to this, to refugees and all the spending that is going on, it seems that refugees are effectively on their own in these very dense urban places. What I mean by that is, when you ask them about their participation in formal organizations like credit associations or other cultural organizations, the highest number we got in any group was about 4%, which means they are basically not participating in any organized ways. But that doesn't mean that they're not relying on their networks. In fact, we found a lot of help being sought informally on things like finding housing and information exchange, less so on financial assistance and finding work. But that dynamic is changing. It goes over time, where in the beginning, people rely more on their informal networks, and that becomes unsustainable in the long term. Then interestingly, as Chaz alluded to earlier, about a quarter of our population was saying that social networks are also a burden on them, which it's not surprising if you think about it. There's literature that lends to that, because it could be, we interpret this as meaning that there could be women or men who have burdens of care toward elderly, children, or other community members. So the other thing I want to highlight is that overall, all of these groups that we looked at are very vulnerable. We didn't have it, always have a basis to compare refugee and host population variable by variable, but they are very, very vulnerable. They're living in very uncertain conditions about their future and in poverty. And there's also, but having said that, there's also variation. Not all these situations are the same. We found, for example, that non-Somalis in Nairobi have a harder time finding work. Ethnically, I saw differences in income levels between Tajiks and Pashtuns in Peshawar. And then also by place, there is a lot of variation. For example, the refugees we talked to in Nairobi seem much more vulnerable. In Gaziantep, about 70% people reported having smartphone access compared to 17% in Peshawar. So it's a mixed bag. And I can say more, but I think I should stop here and let the conversation flow.
Super, thank you. In getting ready for today, I picked up a new book by Alexander Betts called Refugee, Economies, where he and his Oxford colleagues describe 3 institutional circumstances that complicate lives for refugees. One is the fact that they exist between international governance and local governance. They're a UNHCR number, or they're some sort of resident in a local community. They exist in between formal and informal markets. And they exist oftentimes between local and transnational economies, either personally traveling back and forth or remittances or money flows between. And so it leads me to ask a question. I know there are legal definitions of this. I don't care about that so much. But when does a refugee become an immigrant? And how should it affect our thinking about how to support these people, either in integrating into a community or, many refugees still intend to return, realistically or not. Some want to go on to a third place. But this intermediate space they occupy between different worlds seems to me complicates thinking about the right sorts of response. And so for any of you, help me think about this question.
Can I jump in?
Sure.
All right. I've made an argument for a long time that we shouldn't see refugees coming to cities as refugees. And I think this goes against the grain of a lot of the humanitarian space, but there's a number of reasons for this. One is empirical. A lot of the work we've done prior to this has suggested that refugees are often less vulnerable than local populations, and certainly less vulnerable than local newly urbanized populations. And so if we're thinking about who needs help most, targeting urban refugees is probably not the way to go. But more importantly, it echoes back to this issue around the politics of this place. That if you try to target and you try to intervene to help refugees in these kind of complex spaces surrounded by mass disparities of wealth and vulnerability, you might help refugees in the short term, but you make them more vulnerable in the long term. Rather, the solution is to say, look, we have population dynamics in this urban space, mass urbanization of our own population coupled with displacement, and that's what we need to be planning for. And to see these as a unified population that is not necessarily going to stay forever. And that applies equally to local populations and displaced populations. Onward mobility, oscillating migration is how people survive, especially in the kind of precarious situations of cities of the South. And so it makes it almost impossible to plan for one category and exclude the others. Rather, there may be instances where you need special aid for the vulnerable, but that vulnerable is not going to just be refugees.
Paolo, you were the lead author on a recent World Bank study, I guess done with UNHCR, on the welfare of Syrian refugees. It was just fascinating detail on some of this. What's the circumstance there on these issues?
Yeah, though I'm not a legal expert,
That's why I'm not asking a legal question.
Yeah, it's important to start with the legal side 1 second, because first we should distinguish between refugees and IDPs. Refugees are non-citizens or the countries where they are, and IDPs they are, and that makes a huge difference in terms of the way that we can approach these long-term questions on when IDPs or refugees stop to be in these conditions. So as far as I know, concerning refugees, there is a period of normally 10 years that the UNHCR considers as the legal period throughout which you remain a refugee. Beyond that, if the refugee conditions are not there anymore, then it can be discontinued, meaning the assistance provided to these people. In the case of IDPs, I'm not aware of similar legal arrangements, particularly because these are citizens of their own country. So it's a question of the state to decide whether they want to consider them IDPs or not, and whether that makes any sense. And it's really a national decision of a national government to make. Now, in the particular case of the Syrian refugees in Jordan and Lebanon, I would tend to agree that giving these labels is not particularly useful, neither in the short term nor in the medium or long term. And why is that? Because essentially what you really need to do is to align the objectives of the host government with the objectives of the international organizations and the objectives of refugees themselves towards a common set of objectives, which is really about livelihoods and creating a community and creating growth and economic development in a particular area. Now, if you're able to do that, which means that you're going to align your development objectives on that particular areas where refugees are with the host country development objectives. Remember, most countries, the host refugees are poor countries, so they have their own development challenges. So if we are talking to the government and say, look, we're going to develop the electricity system, the water system, the sewage system, and this is going to be long-term, and it's going to cover a much larger part of your population, it's going to be sustainable. That is something that serves a community that is made of refugees and host population. And so governments, when we started to have that kind of discussion, they started to be much more, they started to listen more and much more interested in what we had to offer. So aligning these two objectives. The other aspects is aligning the objectives of humanitarian development organizations. Again, we are used to thinking in boxes, but in fact, on the very short and medium term, we have very similar objectives. Remember, you leave a child out of school for 2 years, we know from Heckman work and colleagues that this is a permanent effect on a person in the long term. So a year out of school, it's important. So we need to understand how to avoid that vacuum in the short and medium term to make sure that children are in school during the right period, because those years are not going to come back. Now, we have about 50% of children in Lebanon who have been out of school for 4 or 5 years. That's a very long period. We know that that has a development impact of these people, whether they stay in Lebanon or Jordan or they move back to Syria during their lifetime. So this is the real challenge. How do we align the objectives between host countries, international organizations, and then between humanitarian organizations and development organizations?
I completely agree with what was said. I might just for 30 seconds put on my honorary IRC hat and say, well, I think that's very true, and the main point that we're all driving at is that alignment is needed, and also to bring together the interests and the programming in a way that's more sustainable, which essentially requires a much larger role of the national government. At the same time, I think there's plenty of space to recognize the particular vulnerability of refugees, whether it's around additional psychosocial support that they need, or because they're not citizens, they may have more difficulty getting documentation that's required to participate in programs and public service delivery. So we can tailor and increase that access. Again, that's not to minimize that other vulnerable populations also face challenges, but we know that refugees face particular ones based on, and I really would underscore the point that you made about local context, and I think the art and science is how do you set up some tools and processes and requirements that will lead to better adaptation to local context, and have the structures in place so those conversations with local governments do happen, and with local communities. And I think that is, again, the beauty of bringing together the expertise of the development and humanitarian communities, because the bread and butter of the World Bank and development actors is precisely talking to those actors, and the bread and butter of humanitarian agencies is to work with refugees and meeting their particular needs. So I think that need to mediate and bring together these actors in a way that's systematic is critical, and I know those are the processes that are being undertaken in preparation for the UN Global Compact in 2018, and also the programming that we discussed earlier.
It's interesting, if all refugees are local, but the refugee policy is not.
Right.
It's international, it's national, and national and international bodies have charge of the money, of the policy. Local leaders have to get up every morning in a local political, economic, social context. And we know in most of the host countries, the arrangements between the national government and local governments are not functioning perfectly. Right. They're not aligned. You're walking into an unaligned set of interests. If I'm a mayor, and even a mayor from an opposition party, how can these compacts help resolve? And those are deep underlying political issues. And your data set is small, I realize, 2.5. Yeah. But in those existing compacts, how have you dealt with those issues, or do they get kicked down the road a little bit?
Well, I don't know if Paulo wants to start out with this, on this.
Go ahead, I'll follow up.
Okay. So it is true that the compacts are agreements, at the national government level, but I do think, one of the points, just as an example, in the Lebanon Compact, it's focused on education, and it is working through the Ministry of Education and Higher Education. And I think one of the beauties of the compact is that, especially since the World Bank is using Program for Results, which is a kind of where the funds are dispersed based on the achievement of specific indicators, that is a way to help align incentives, again, not only among the international community, but also with the multiple local agencies that the Ministry of Education itself is working with. So I think there are some mechanisms in place to help encourage that alignment. Again, they could still be improved. One of the points that we make and CGD more broadly makes is that you want to shift the payment more and more towards outcomes so that there's more flexibility, but there's a greater focus on achieving the outcomes we all desire. So there are improvements that could be made, but I do think there are mechanisms. And one broader point that I would make is that, you know, this is not at all to diminish the political complications that are involved. You know, you're talking about strategic states like Lebanon and Jordan, and so I think that we appreciate the fact that those complications exist. But in fact, in my mind, that strengthens the need for these quasi-technocratic procedures to be in place so that we can kind of work through those while elevating the evidence base. Because without those, then it's quite easy to say, well, I've always wanted this project to happen, why don't you fund it? But if there are procedures that are put in place, then there's at least that check and balance and that set as a standard.
So I don't know the extent to which the two of you were involved in these actual existing compacts, but I'm interested, what were the most difficult points to come to agreement on, or the ones that you couldn't, or that didn't come, not that you couldn't, but that didn't come get agreed upon?
Yeah, I think the Jordan Compact was really the first one, and when I said that there is no blueprint, this was one of the places where we started to experiment. So we have to look at the Jordan Compact as an experiment. Now, on the good side, we can say that the host government objectives and the international community and refugees objective got aligned, because otherwise we would not have a compact today, right? So the government agreed that they needed special economic zones. They agreed that Syrian refugees could be hired in these zones. They agreed to give work permits to the Syrian refugees to work into these zones. In exchange, there was an agreement that the products that would come out of these zones would be marketable in the EU, and the EU did its part. So this alignment came together. Now, is that enough for the compact to work? No, of course not. I mean, any one of you who worked in development projects knows that it's the micromanagement of micro-incentives that eventually makes a success, right? So we do have problems in the Jordan Compact, and we shouldn't hide them. On the contrary, we should discuss them. For example, we know that a lot of refugees that received work permits were offered jobs and did not take these jobs. Now, why? We're trying to understand that, but certainly there are issues that we don't understand very well, and issues that we may understand and we don't just think apply to refugees. Think about a mother with 3 children that is offered a job in a compact zone. I mean, she still has 3 children to take care of. So if you don't have alternative mechanisms to support and take care of the children, this person cannot take the job. So the micromanagement of these and the micro incentives of these compacts, it's an open question. We need to work on them, understand where the issues are. This is what we're trying to do now. We're trying to evaluate these kind of efforts, and we have a program to do that. But we're very far from ideal solutions, because eventually the problem are really micro, and this is where we fail.
Mar, what are refugees themselves saying they want?
3 things. Work permits, cash assistance, and healthcare. Those are the 3 that we heard coming back. But you know, this really hits the whole issue of work permits is really important, because this is where we felt in our qualitative work also refugees feeling that they feel like that they could be an asset to the local economy that they're living in. And I think broadly speaking, if I can go back and to your point about local governments, a lot of these places that are hosting urban refugees now, their local governments don't have fiscal, administrative, or political power or capacity to manage their own affairs, let alone handle this exogenous shock. So, for example, in Pakistan, we talk to people in the local government of Peshawar. There is no legitimate representation of the Afghan population, even though they've lived there for 30 years. And then in any case, all these decisions about when the Pakistani government will extend their registration cards are made at the very highest level of government, and that has to do with foreign policy considerations. Afghanistan is obviously strategically a very important place, and so the government takes into account all of those sort of high-level dynamics, and there is really no power at the local level to manage their own affairs. For example, the mayor of Peshawar or the Nazim of Peshawar doesn't have the power to hire or fire the head of the water service unit. They can't manage their own affairs. So that is one thing. The other thing, the disconnect between wants and needs is also that perhaps because of compulsion or the necessity of these circumstances, the biggest category in terms of the support that is being given to these people or has been given in the past is food, shelter, and clothing, and sort of the basic needs. What our surveys have showed in terms of correlations, obviously we couldn't do causality here, is that we think they need more skills training and more language training. So while this is not a big problem in Peshawar, where everybody speaks Pashto and most people have learned Urdu, we found a very strong correlation between people who speak Turkish or English or Kurdish in Gaziantep versus those who do not. So that's something that they need to do. And also people are living in very stressed out circumstances. So legal counseling, support services, and things like that also have to be made part and parcel of the thing. But I think that has to come with the sense that these people can be assimilated, that these people should be integrated, and that there could be benefits to host governments for doing those things.
If I may add just one point, because I think you raised it very well, but it's extremely important. And that's, again, a difference between refugees and IDPs. Refugees are in a foreign country, and they don't really have a structured political voice in this host country. So we assume, we meaning international organizations in general, that the UNHCR provides that voice. But that's not necessarily always the case. The UNHCR traditionally has done an excellent job in providing voice to the refugees, but that's different from having a political representation of refugees that channel their own concerns to the international community. So I think there is work to be done on that side.
Lauren, you had a point.
Just a few. I mean, one, I think, all of these agreements with the national level are very important and good. But what we've seen, whether it's in Lebanon or South Africa, is an agreement with the national level to help refugees can be a resource for a local politician who doesn't want them in their community. And so these compacts and their development, I think, need to very much more explicitly engage with local government authorities in thinking through their commitments, because what government officials feel is that this is being foisted on them. It's an unfunded mandate. They're being told to integrate and support these people. They've been given no resources to do so. I think we also have to recognize, and this is building on Amar's point, that local governments in many parts of the Global South don't effectively govern the cities. And we need to move beyond the formal structures to recognize that it's property developers, it's militias, it's gangsters. These are the de facto governance of many of these spaces. And we need to also talk about how do we incorporate and engage with them, because they're the ones who control the spaces, they're the ones who control the markets. Making an agreement with local government is not going to open those spaces up to refugees. And the last point is that I think we also have to be very careful about looking for a refugee voice. One of the issues that came out of the research we did was that refugees do well when they stop organizing as refugees, when they organize as parents or as disabled or as traders, and trying to incorporate them into the political process as refugees further ghettoizes them, right? And so that we need to, if we're looking for ways of assessing the populations, to think about cross-cutting areas where we can build those solidarities and not say, look, you must come forward and claim your rights as refugees, because that can also make them highly vulnerable and visible to the state, but rather allow them to become invisible wherever possible.
So Cindy, at the risk of asking you to peel back a few more pages of your upcoming report, what's your reaction? How do we get not just refugees, but local poor people in the
was
room?
unwittingly one of the co-authors, because one of the things we recommend is that we have to work more with local actors. And I would go back to what I mentioned about, and I didn't provide detail around, kind of what are the best practices and structures we can put in place so that those conversations happen earlier on in the process. And so I used to work at an independent U.S. development agency called the Millennium Challenge Corporation, and they have a structure where there's a local implementing agency and it's governed by a board, and the board is chaired by the government, but then there are public and private actors who are members of the board. And I'm not saying that's the perfect solution, where you would want humanitarian and development actors, you would want people from the line ministries who are engaged, people from local governments, and then also civil society representatives. So we offer that as just one example and way to think about how this consultation could be done in a more systematic way. And then just one comment on the voice of the refugees. I look forward to reading your report. I have not read it yet, but I guess I would just offer that perhaps it's not an either or, because there is fundamentally, as Paulo mentioned, the normal contract between citizen and state doesn't apply to the refugee, because if it's whether it's a democracy or not, refugees are fundamentally not part of that equation. And so I do feel that while it completely makes sense to me that you need other horizontal connections, trade unions, let's make a daycare together, whatever it is, like those are the social connections that you need to effectively integrate. At the same time, there may be gaps and a need for the collective voices of refugees to be represented in certain fora.
I have a bunch of other questions, but I'm hit the time when we want to open this up to our colleagues in the audience. I'm hoping one of the people in the audience will ask about the role of the private sector. There are microphones, and I ask you to wait until you're handed one so that we can all hear you. I'll start in the back of the room and sort of work my way around here. It's right behind you, ma'am. If you could identify yourself and then ask a crisp question or comment so we can get as many people in.
My name is Nabila Shibli, and you ask a good question. What do refugees want? I just came from Dadaab, Jordan, Gaziantep, Adana, and I met with refugees from Lebanon. In each country, they want different things. In Jordan, they want safety for their children because they are getting abused in different ways. And they want safety for their children, and they want to go back home. In Turkey, they have education, they're well taken care of, and they want to go back home. While in Dadaab, they said we want education for our kids before we go back home. And in Jordan, I think the Turkish government did a great job with refugees, and I think it should be replicated in Jordan and Lebanon. And I think we should speak with each other. What did they do right to hear 80% of the refugees, they're happy there?
Thank you very much. I'm going to collect a couple of questions, and then we'll ask the panel to, it's in the back and on the aisle.
Thank you. I'm Erin Naylor from the Center for Strategic International Studies. I work at the Project on Prosperity and Development, which focuses on the intersection between the private sector and development community. So I am going to ask about the private sector. You talked a lot about both public-private partnerships as well as incentivizing like local buy-in, local governments. How do you make this profitable for the private sector? How do you get them involved? What's the next step there? I mean, giving work permits to refugees is a great step, but like you said, sometimes the refugees are then not taking jobs. There's obviously a mismatch there. How do you square that circle?
Thank you. And one more question here, the woman in the red top.
Good morning. My name is Kim Weichel. I head an international women's peacebuilding organization. So one comment first, which is they're often differing needs between men and women refugees and IDPs, and how important it is if you're including refugees in any kind of coordination structure that you have equal numbers of men and women, because you need to represent all the diverse needs. My question, though, is about how can you bridge the resentment with local communities? If you look in this country, there's a lot of resentment towards immigrants and refugees. They may be terrorists, right? They may be, I mean, all this fear that's built up that's sadly limiting our country from taking in refugees. So I understand the important point of working with local officials, but that doesn't necessarily reduce the resentment. So how do you bridge that? If we could give some examples, thank you.
Okay, why don't we get some responses to these three questions. One about the fact that there are very different needs, different refugee populations in different places, the role of the private sector, and then this issue of women's needs being different.
Sure.
Go ahead.
Okay, great. I completely agree that we have to learn across different programs to see, you know, I think some of your survey work, again, is moving in the right, and also the surveys that Paulo conducted is moving in the right direction of figuring out what people want and how we can be responsive. I think, again, back to the point of local context matters. I think Jordan and Lebanon, in the case of Syrian refugees, have felt under greater pressure because as a proportion of their population, it's much higher. So in Lebanon, about 1 out of 5 people is a Syrian refugee. And so I think Turkey has, while there's definitely improvements that could be made in Turkey as well, they've been able to absorb more, partly due to as a proportion of the population, it is smaller. On the private sector, I completely agree. I'm sure many of you heard about the announcements last fall at the Leaders Summit, where many private sector actors stepped up and committed more than $650 million to help with the crisis around the world, not only in the Middle East. And I think that's a step in the right direction, including George Soros's commitment to not give it as grants necessarily, but to invest in companies that will employ and help refugees, and also in refugee-owned companies. I think that some of the barriers, as Paulo mentioned, they're not specific to refugees. So there's high unemployment in Jordan. It's a difficult investment climate in Jordan. And that's, again, why I think there's a lot of potential to use this, to turn this crisis into an opportunity to have a rigorous diagnosis of what needs to change and to align incentives to encourage that investment. I also think there are a lot of promising efforts on the micro side, so opportunities in the gig economy or business process outsourcing, where we can help hopefully scale up jobs in the nearer term, and I think those should be invested in. And then finally, I think that Paulo mentioned that the compacts are not perfect. Of course, we're so delighted that the World Bank has engaged so heavily on how they might be improved. And I think one of the downsides potentially around a compact structure is that you negotiate the multi-year benchmarks up front. And so we propose that you should keep a kind of innovation fund. So, maybe next time we'll know that we have to do more around childcare, but then there's going to be some other unexpected problem. So I think in the structure of the compact, there should be a kind of innovation fund, and that links back to the private sector, because you won't necessarily know at the outset what all the barriers are to increased private sector involvement. On the issue of representing both genders, I think that's absolutely critical. And in the Jordan case, we've seen that while that only 4% of the work permits are applied for and received by women. And so, and there are a lot of factors around that, but you do see a greater demand for them than actual achievement. And so how you need women's engagement throughout the life cycle of the program to make that happen. I unfortunately don't have a silver bullet on how you address resentment between communities. I do think it's an area where it is very important, whether it's in the compact structure or in other programs, to not overly focus on just those outcomes like increased income. Those are all incredibly important, and I do think they help address some of those underlying tensions when you're focused on shared outcomes of both refugees and host populations, but I also think we need to look at the research that is out there around dialogue, around building horizontal connections among communities, and make sure that there are resources and political attention that are placed in this new focus area.
Yeah, I think, the background to the three questions, it's really about voice, right? If we provide voice to people, we learn that there are different countries. We learn that maybe why the Jordan Compact does not work in certain areas, and we learn why men and women are different, right? Now, I wanted to clarify that this is different from political representation. The word political representation is very sensitive in host countries. Most governments would tell you that they don't want refugees to become political actors, have a voice.
Or be at the table?
Or be at the table. And I would agree that that can be self-defeating for the refugees themselves. So I think the word voice is a much better word to use. We need voice. We need to know what people are saying. And if we attach a label of refugee to a person, that, in a sense, covers all the other labels that this person is. Is a disabled, is female, is male, is a child, is not, and the needs are very different. So voice is important. Political representation is a hazard, I would say. We have to be very careful how to use these words as well. And we need to, again, talk to these people, because it turns out that they're not different from any other persons. They have exactly the same need. And if you need a child care institution, you need a child care institution whether you're refugees or non-refugees.
Lauren?
Yeah, just a few sort of interactions. One, just again, a caution around representation. One of the issues we've seen over and over again is that the refugee voice is captured by a particular segment of the refugees. So in South Africa, the Somali Association has worked against, in some instances, local integration out of the hope that they can get resettled elsewhere. And that has been the voice that has been heard. And we have to be very careful about who are we asking. The most vulnerable populations are not the ones that will come forward and participate in these sorts of meetings and in these sorts of consultations. So it's just a word of warning. On the issue, I've done a lot of work on questions of xenophobia, and I also wish I had an answer. But I think that there's some things that we should not do, and the UNHCR and others have been very fond of public awareness campaigns. We've also been and you're seeing it more and more now, generating information to show that refugees are good for the local community. And while that might be true at aggregate, it's usually not true for the exact neighborhoods where refugees are living. And so people, as they do here, will say, well, immigration is good for the US, but it's not good for me, right? And so we need to think about how we build local solidarities. And I think this is, again, moving from from a person-based assistance to a place-based. And so I know in Turkey, for example, one of the efforts was to give refugees not direct food aid, but vouchers that could only be used in local businesses, right? And so that created a sort of business solidarity with the local population. They wanted them to stay, because this was a big influx of not cash, which can go anywhere, but vouchers that could only be used in local businesses. And I think that kind of thing can work. We also have to recognize that these attitudes are mobilized. And so the more we can do, and it sounds bad, but to co-opt local politicians or local actors to make them see that there are benefits of keeping them there, they can do a lot to manage these local tensions. Whereas if local actors see that there's benefits from mobilizing hatred, they will do so.
If I can add just two quick points on the point that you raised about xenophobia. I think at least I was surprised when I look at the statistics we collected, where we looked at the structures of social networks and found something like 85% people in Peshawar, refugees in Peshawar, they identified only other refugees in their network. So there's limited interaction between the two communities. And so we can increase that, whether it's formal institutionalized ways or other means like sports activities, even cultural things where people can come together to get to know each other and talk to one another. I think that would be a good local level idea. And on the private sector point, we actually have some our ongoing work at the Urban Institute, which is supported supported by the US Department of State, is actually now looking at this issue of the private sector. So it's when we're looking at the private sector not as a source of investment that would fill the gap between the appeals and what's being donated, but actually to leverage the technical capacities that the private sector might have to solve problems so that we have more leverage on technical things, on things like financial inclusion. There's some promising work there. So we're beginning to now explore how is it that businesses might see a business benefit, like a profitability motive perhaps, in working with refugees or making refugees their customers, so that they can go beyond just the CSR or in-kind assistance model into more sort of mainstream business activities. And we'll have some findings hopefully soon.
By September.
By September.
When the report is due. Let me take another round of questions. I'll start right here in the front on the aisle. Thank you.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Carol Tan. I'm with the Rockefeller Foundation. I thought that this was really, really helpful. I learned a lot. One of the points that was mentioned was around alignment around long-term development of the place. So alignment between the different stakeholders. But we know that in Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey, many of the other countries, for many years they resisted sort of permanent infrastructure and things like that, even though the development implications were clear for the place. So I think, yes, like development alignment makes a lot of sense, but precisely because the political issues aren't quite addressed and the state, the government, the country is not monolithic, that doesn't, I mean, the outcomes we're seeking doesn't really happen. So I was curious as to what you thought about other areas of alignment besides overall development goals. I mean, how do we think about different tribes, different political actors, different levels of government, et cetera? Thanks.
It sounds like an easy question to answer. The woman right beside you.
Good morning. My name is Diana Cayley from Crown Agents USA. One of the things, this sort of builds on the question that you asked before. So I was at the Forced Migration and Refugee Studies program at the American University in Cairo about 10 years ago. And what I saw in my research there was this sort of tacit and overt racism between Arabs from Egypt and Sudanese women that I was working with. So I was wondering if you have any example, this is quite common, I think, in a lot of these cities you're working in. Have you seen any kind of interventions or programs that have successfully overcome this racial bias barrier? Thanks.
Okay, and third question over here. I'm sorry if I'm missing some people, but if we go quickly, we'll get to everybody.
Hi, thanks. My name is Red Shufani. I'm at IFPRI. I'm from Lebanon, and I used to work at the American University of Beirut. And I used to work with Palestinian refugees in Beirut and Syrian refugees in the south. And my question is, how much were local universities involved in this global compact or these programs that you're talking about? Because local universities are the ones who know not all the answers to these questions, but they know the culture, they know the sensitivities, they know how things work. They know when you go to a mayor's office, he's going to be like, come back tomorrow. When he means tomorrow, he means next year, you know? There are all these sensitivities that local people know. So I was just curious if they were part of this discussion and this knowledge sharing that should be two ways all the time. Thanks.
Thank you very much. We want to take those three, anybody?
Someone else has to start this time.
I guess.
Are you smiling, Paolo? Go.
No, I'll take the easier one and leave the most my colleagues. So if there was an easy one here, there isn't. So let me answer the first question, try to answer the first question, other types of alignments. The World Development Report from the World Bank that just came out, it's on governance and the law. And there is one interesting aspect of the report that tells us something that I think is very useful, is that when you look at economic policies, you first have to look at the policy arena, this is what they call, right? The stakeholder analysis. How do you know who controls what, and this was mentioned before, in the community you're going to work in, right? Are there rackets? Are there, informal, formal? Who is controlling what market? These are all questions that are very important, and then we don't tend to ask in the short term because we are overwhelmed by the necessity to do things. And yet, if we don't understand the policy arena in the particular community, it's very difficult to intervene and turn your policies into effective policies. So one of the lessons that I think comes out from this World Development Report, and I can tell you that that's very normative for the World Bank, and we admit that, is really to think strategically at who really pulls the string in a particular area, look at it, do the analysis, and then trying to work with it. And these are the other types of alignments that we may want to think about.
Can I jump in? I mean, I think that to take your, well, actually, let me start with your question, which is around the involvement of local universities and other knowledge producers. And I think generally they're excluded from these processes, as you know. I think it was, in some ways, a rhetorical question. But I think that it's incredibly important, and it builds on this point I was making before around local literacy, and that the effective protection is often based less on legal principles or agreements with national authorities than with being able to navigate the very specific politics of the place that you're speaking about. And that speaks to your question about other ways in. And there is a group of work started here, but I think works elsewhere, which talks about forms of bureaucratic incorporation, which is not necessarily, I think Hamilton has worked on this explicitly, which is making appeals to professional societies, whether it's educators or healthcare providers or others, who may be less concerned with someone's legal status and are more concerned with this person as a vulnerable mother or as a disabled person or as I think that's one way. But some of the work that we've seen in Nairobi also sees that you can make very small appeals, and this requires you to really understand the incentives, to local bureaucrats. And so one of the groups, Refuge Point in Nairobi, there was a new health insurance scheme and worked with an official basically to fill in thousands of forms on his behalf to get refugees on this scheme. He becomes the all-star sort of employee of the month for signing up all of these people, and thousands of people are now on this system who wouldn't otherwise have been. It was a non-political, no one had to know, it was invisible, but and I think, but this requires a very micro-level, fine-grained, sort of assessment of what's happening.
But also an accident, if you would put to a political test whether refugees should be able to sign up for health care.
They would have said no.
Yep.
Right.
Just to build on what was said on the question of alignment, I think before I didn't as clearly distinguish as one should between the important activity of stakeholder analysis. So you're kind of gathering the information on who is pulling which strings, who matters to who. You're creating this map of actors, and that's very important as baseline understanding, and then to figure out your strategy and tactics. And then I talked a little bit more about the consultation. When you're developing a program, they should happen ideally sequentially, and then you know who you're consulting with, so that you don't only talk to the chief, and you only talk to the most organized groups. And then finally, the structures. So that's what are the structures you're using, whether it's a board or a stakeholder committee that meets on a regular basis. And I do think those are three separate things, and they're all required. And I would add, one of the complaints about compacts is, there's this urgent crisis now, or any complex program, not just compact, there's this urgent crisis, how could you take so much time to develop it? And my response to that is it's better to take the time up front while continuing to deliver the urgent humanitarian assistance that's required, and public works programs, things that generate jobs more quickly. But I think it's worth taking the time for all the reasons that we discussed and the facts on the ground, which is that this displacement is likely to be protracted for 10 or 20 years. And if you rush into things without doing this consultation and analysis, then it's less likely that you'll have successful programs. On the question of how do you combat racism and xenophobia, I do think some of what you said is so important about how public awareness campaigns, et cetera, can really backfire. But what really has been shown to matter are these personal connections. And so, it's not a personal connection in any context, a productive interaction, but how do we create the environment and support those soccer clubs, those mothers associations in ways that will help facilitate those personal connections?
And I can lend some support to that, because we found in Peshawar, for example, that the social networks are very, very gendered. So women have a completely different experience of the public space, and their social networks are completely different. But there were little sort of small informal, what they call committees, which are like savings groups with 12 or 15 women come together, have a cup of coffee or tea at 10 in the morning, after sending kids to school, and then talk about their issues. So there's some informal evidence of that. I don't know if there are any formalized mechanisms to expand that in place quite yet. And on the issue of alignment, my view is that it is very important to align the economic interests of the two communities. I think that should drive that. And in our analysis, we found, not surprisingly, that refugees are taking more and more jobs in the informal economy. So if you look at the economic value chains, they're on the lower end of the productivity scale. And there could be, if we had a more systematic way of looking at those economic value chains, it may be that refugees are not always displacing local jobs. Maybe they're taking the bottom of the pile jobs, and that has maybe positive impacts on labor market. So I was going to say that there's a need to understand that and do more studies that see where are they spending the money, what kind of investments are coming in, and what's the labor market dynamic.
I'm not sure if I agree, Amar. Think about the social cost of the Ethiopian doctors and engineers I have driving taxis here in the District of Columbia. There are costs to being only able to fill those informal jobs. We've got time for a couple more questions. The woman in the stripe right here and blue on the aisle.
Hi, thank you. I'm Christy Jaya, and I work for the Embassy of the Republic of Indonesia, but today I come here independently. And you touched a little bit on my question. So we talked about how international support and grants are good incentives for local governments and the private sector to integrate refugees. And I'm wondering whether there are specific assets that the refugees bring that would that are good assets for the local government and the private sector. And because we also talked about how they come with a language barrier, and so how do we level that playing field a little? Thank you.
Great, thank you. Ma'am.
Hi, my name is Soba. I'm an independent consultant. Cindy knows this. Hi. I'm working with an impact investment fund based in Brussels, Cois Invest, to structure an impact fund, a development impact fund, to improve livelihoods for Syrian refugees in Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey. And so we just completed an 8-month-long feasibility study, coming up with some interesting findings. And this goes back to Paula's point about some of the providers that we were working with. Some of the feedback was that there is indeed some reluctance on the behalf of refugees to take up some of the great programs that are being offered, because there's a fear that it will kind of cut off their cash assistance, or kind of compromise their application for a third country resettlement. And so I guess my question is, how is the implementation process for the compacts coming along, and what's being done to kind of coordinate, going back to the coordination between humanitarian assistance and kind of the development side of the equation?
Okay, let me get one last question at the back. Thank you.
Hello, I'm a master's student at Georgetown, and I'm writing my thesis on how the private sector is helping refugees integrate and find employment. I just came back from interviewing HR directors in Germany on finding the incentives to why their companies are doing this right now. So building the business case really on why. My question is, to what extent, and some specific examples on how your organizations are including the private sector in this dialogue, and whether you are including the private sector as well in the skills training and language courses, because that will really help fill the skills gap and prevent informality and prevent doctors from being taxi drivers. Thank you.
Any volunteers? Private sector?
Oh, not
okay.
Private sector.
Whatever, go ahead. Why don't we just go in order? Paolo, I'll let you go first to answer the question. Choose.
No, this is a bit the core of the problem, which is is the individual that we refer to as refugee a productive individual that is going to add on to the host country or not, right? And I think a lot of the pushback on refugees, it's actually around this point, because there is this sense that this person is not adding, is taken away, that the cake is of a fixed GDP, is a fixed dimension, and you add people, and you have to split the cake with more people. Now, we need to reverse the process, right? So how do we reverse it? Is that the cake can grow, and the cake can grow making the most of the characteristics of these people. And these people are not different from other people. You will have agriculture people, you will have doctors, you will have all sorts of people. The question is that at the present time, we're not organized to think in those terms in the very short term. So I'll make you a very precise example. The UNHCR collects data on refugees. They call level 1, level 2, level 3 data collection. Level 1 is when they cross the border and they start asking the first questions. And these questions cover 10, 15 different variables. Now, those variables are important for a lot of UNHCR programs, but do not capture the essential labor market characteristics of these people, so that as soon as you cross the border, we can put you in a database that says you are a doctor, and someone can look at the database and see whether they need you or not, right? So this is where we're really changing. This is what it means to work the humanitarian together with the development agencies together. This is where it matters. We need to shift from the label refugees to the label these are doctors with skills or agricultural labor or other types of people.
I saw on that point, I think, a variation in the levels of education skills that these different populations bring. So in Peshawar, 43% people that we talked to basically had never gone to school. So they're completely illiterate, can't even write or read. And less than 1% of them have gone to university. These numbers were a little bit higher, more like around 7 to 8% in Gaziantep and in Nairobi. But it really augments what Paulo was saying, that the impression that leaves the host communities is that these are just people who have, they're a burden on us. So this again goes back to the point that I was saying earlier, is that if there is a clearer understanding of within, let's say, a mayor of a city, if they know how their economy looks like, what are the skills gap, then these new visa regimes that they're talking about, let's say in Pakistan, we now have the cabinet just approved a business visa regime and an investor visa regime for Afghans, but none of those are based on any economic analysis, and so they're political decisions taken by political people. But I think it is, maybe local universities and people like ourselves can actually bulk that up by providing some actual analysis on the shape and form of the local economies.
All right, just very quickly, two points. I mean, one, to the colleague from Georgetown, I think in many of these places we have to ask, what is the private sector? I mean, we're not talking, most people are not in formal business in many of the cities of the South. And so we can engage with industrial development, but that's not there. It's largely absent. And so we need to think about what kind of markets are people actually participating in? Is it small shops? Is it sweatshops? What is it that's happening? And I think we need a sort of more holistic and heterogeneous understanding of what the private sector is. I think just to comment on and build a little bit on Amar and Paula's point about the resources that refugees bring, we tend to assess these sort of things in economic terms. Can they work in the labor market? Can they contribute skills? Can they do things? We have to also, I think, evaluate them as a political resource, right? And in many instances, they are a political resource in a negative way, in the sense that having refugees there is an opportunity to build a constituency among the host population by scapegoating refugees. That's an enormous resource, and we've seen that in many places around the world. We need to shift that so that for local politicians, it becomes a positive resource. In some ways, that means essentially buying them off or providing them incentives so that having these people come in is good for them in a way that doesn't involve benefiting by scapegoating, right? And that means allowing them to deliver products, allowing them to deliver to their constituencies. And that's why I was saying from the start, funneling money through local government rather than providing directly to refugees is a way of turning the refugees into what I would consider a positive political resource, in that it builds incentives for local communities to absorb these people rather than to exclude them.
We are really up on our time. And so I have to cut us off so the CGG will charge us rent after noon. But I wanted to ask each of our panelists if you've got one top recommendation or one takeaway, one recommendation for more research was needed or whatever that you can you want people to walk away with, if you could share that.
Yeah,
Start with
great.
Cindy.
Something that I'm thinking a lot about and hope to do more work on in the future and welcome a conversation with all of you is that we've been talking about effective integration and improving the livelihoods of refugees. That's part of the rhetoric also of countries that would like refugees to stay in over there and not in their own countries. But I think there is a paradox that's developing, which is that effective livelihoods interventions will increase people's incomes. These are all things we want, but that will also increase the long-term migration pressures on Europe and other countries. And so how do we bring together this important work, recognize the long-time trends, and help bring together these two global compacts on refugees and migration so that we see more effective, sustainable solutions? Last thing, please come on April 19th. Look forward to seeing you all.
There I go. Okay, I mean, just two very quick points. I know you said one, but they're really together. I mean, I think one, we need to see this migration displacement as part of urban planning and development. And we've tended to see it as a crisis, as exceptional, as outside of that. If we're talking about the Middle East, we're talking about Pakistan, this is planning. This is development. This is not something that can be done outside of those processes. There still is a role for the humanitarians and the humanitarian projects, but I think for them, the lesson is, and the second point, right, is that they really need to up their urban game. They're bringing housing experts from camps or rural settings into the cities. They're bringing livelihoods experts who know about agriculture into the cities. And while you can have urban agriculture, we need experts on labor markets, on housing markets, on business development. And that, to date, has not been part of the humanitarian enterprise.
Thank you. Amar.
In addition to what I said about the need to do studies on economic aspects of this, the other thing that severely limits refugee well-being, in my view, is the uncertainty about their future. So if we can increase that, give them more clarity on what their legal status might be or what they could do in the next few weeks or months, that would really change their worldview for the better.
Paolo, any last thoughts?
Yeah, I would say that in the very long term, if we take a big breath and look at the 21st century, global migration is going to increase, and we need to keep investing in people in the long term. Investing in people in the short term will not do it. We know that has impact in the long term. And so we have to keep thinking that whatever we do it for the long term. We educate people because in the future there will be workers.
Thank you. Please join me in thanking our panelists for a lively and interesting discussion. And let me also thank the Center for Global Development for hosting us and for the Urban Institute and CGD staff who actually produced this event. Thank you very, very, very much to them.
Thank you.